This program is a Warren Steibel production in association with South Carolina ETV. Funding for Firing Line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Annenberg Foundation and the Friends of Firing Line.
The question before the House has to do with the use of language. There is no formal way in which speech can be regulated, but speech is nevertheless routinely regulated in carefully edited books, journals, and newspapers. If you write the New York Times, quotes, "Give Al Gore and I a chance," the editor will correct the syllogism unless it is immune because those were words actually uttered by the President of the United States. Our guest today is Professor Steven Pinker, a latitudinarian in language whose book, The Language Instinct, How the Mind Creates Language, was published last year to some acclaim. Mr. Pinker appears to have no quarrel with language, however it is extruded. Some years ago, I wrote an introduction to an edition of the American Heritage Dictionary, and begging your leave, I quote myself, I wrote that, quotes, "Precision is still possible precisely because mere usage, however prolonged, does not baptize. Providence in due course sometimes accepts into its bosom sinners, but usually only after time served in the antechambers." Well, off we go. Professor Pinker was born in Canada, is a graduate of McGill with a doctorate from Harvard in psychology, and is now head of the Cognitive Neuroscience Department at MIT. I begin by asking Dr. Pinker whether he objects to the habit of some dictionaries in designating particular words as, say, slang or even illiterate.
Oh, no, I have no objection. I think a good writer wants to know how words will be received, how people are currently using them, and that's one of the crucial bits of information about a word that you want to know.
Well, but don't they, in making those assertions, assume an authority which your book denies them?
No, I think we should just be clear what we mean by proper language. I think there are differences in dialects. I think that rural Americans speak a slightly different dialect than urban Americans. There are forms of English that urban black people speak that are simply different dialects. I don't think that any old dialect should be used in newspapers or journalism or science. I think there should be standardized forms, just like there are standards for what side of the road you drive on. It's good to have a degree of consistency. In certain forums, everyone should use the same form of speech. I'm simply objecting to calling, say, black English bad grammar or fractured syntax. It's simply the syntax of a different dialect. And just as there's nothing wrong inherently with driving on the left or driving on the right, as long as everyone does it on the same side in the same country, there's nothing wrong with other dialects of English, but in certain arenas we want to establish a standard and we all want to use the same form. So that's really the distinction I'm making. I don't think that people should write however they please, wherever they please. I think we should just be clearer as to what we're saying when we insist on certain standards.
Well, but to what extent is there an aesthetic dimension, and to what extent is it the responsibility, so to speak, guardians of the language to look over? You quote with great satisfaction Dr. Johnson, who says, look, you can't do it because the words get away from you. And the Harvard professor who wrote the other half of the introduction of that particular dictionary makes that point. What he says is, look, words are going to acquire their own meaning, and there is no law save usage. Under the circumstances, it becomes silly to attempt to arrest the natural evolution of a word. I didn't find you disagreeing with that.
No, that's right. I think there's some distinctions that I personally would like to keep. I like disinterested, meaning impartial, as opposed to bored. I like parameter, meaning dimension of variation, as opposed to perimeter or limit. But on the other hand, taking the long view, I realize there's not a whole lot that I'm going to be able to do about it. Language is always changing. You and I aren't talking now the way people spoke 200 years ago or 300 years ago. At any point in time, people looking at this change see it as a deterioration. In the 17th century, they were saying that English had deteriorated so much and things were getting so bad that people would be just grunting and squeaking in 100 years. And in the 18th century, people said that language would deteriorate by the 19th century and so on. There has never been any language in any period in history that has not changed. And so we should, while striving for the clearest and most aesthetically pleasing language, realize at the same time that it is going to change and there is nothing we can do about it.
Well, I don't see why you sound so helpless on the question, because one of the things you can do about it is instruct your students not to abuse the language, right? I mean, my father would have dropped dead if you'd said, give it to Al Gore and I. I mean, I think he would have come to think of it. I think he would have dropped dead. Now, this was in part, and this is not uninteresting, because he spent a lot of time in his life, 30, 40 years of his life in Mexico. And for whatever reason, I don't know, they don't make grammatical mistakes in Spanish. It's inconceivable that you would get the objective pronoun mixed up with the subjective pronoun. Now, therefore, that sort of closes in and becomes an aesthetic sensibility, which you tend to fight to maintain. Now, when Webster's 3 came out, what was it, 50, 59, they stopped classifying words as slang, vulgar, illiterate, and they were given a wonderfully resonant tongue lashing by Dwight MacDonald in the New Yorker, who said precisely the point of a dictionary is to try to maintain standards. Now, this doesn't mean that you can say we refuse to recognize the use of the word parameter when what you really mean is perimeter. Eventually you have to give up on these matters, like hopefully, but it does attempt to prolong the establishment of correct usage, doesn't it?
Well, think about what dictionaries do. When you say that they're there to preserve standards, but where do these standards come from? It's not as if we have a tribunal or a legislature that decides what's going to be proper English. In fact, if you go visit the headquarters of a dictionary publisher, what they do is they collect lots and lots of slips of paper on how people use words. So, in a way, the dictionaries and the people who try to speak properly are taking in each other's laundry. There's not...
Well, that's not 100% true. Now, the Heritage Dictionary, for instance, I've been on their panel for 30 years, and a lot of other people have, and about twice a year, you get 6 pages of things. Do you approve or disapprove? Greatly, ungreatly, or the following, and you click, 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 click. And then when they reproduce that word, they tell you how their usage panel reacts. For instance, hopefully, meaning we hope so, was much more approved 20 years ago than now, because now people have reacted to the misuse of it as a sort of one step too many. I'm just quoting the American Heritage Dictionary. Now, in that sense, wouldn't you say that they are attempting to collect enlightened aesthetic views on the use of language where there's ambiguity?
They are, and in fact, the American Heritage Dictionary is a wonderful dictionary precisely because it takes such an enlightened view towards usage. In fact, they give excellent reasons why, hopefully, in the supposedly incorrect sense...
They defend it.
They defend it,
yeah.
with excellent reasons. They say that it improves precision because there are things that you can say using hopefully, as in hopefully the treaty will pass, that you can't say if you were to follow the guidelines of the purists. The purists would have you say something like, it is to be hoped that the treaty will pass.
Or one hopes.
Or one hopes,
yeah.
Or I hope that the treaty will pass, none of which mean the same thing. I mean, I don't want to say I hope the treaty will pass, because who cares what I think? If I'm saying hopefully, I mean to express the opinion that it is
in the best of all
by
possible
everyone.
world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is to be hoped that the treaty will pass, has all of the sins of bad writing. It's wordy, it uses the passive voice, it's vague. Hopefully the treaty will pass is much more precise and much more aesthetically pleasing. And I think that's probably my quarrel with a lot of the language purists. It's not that I don't believe that language should be clear and precise and aesthetically pleasing. It's just that a lot of the traditional rules get in the way of that. To give you an example, one of my favorite bits of prose is the opening of Star Trek. its 5-year mission to boldly go where no man has gone before, a split infinitive.
Not to go boldly, yeah.
Now, to go boldly, I mean, that sounds awful. It ruins the iambic meter.
Yeah.
It doesn't improve clarity or precision, and in fact, there's no reason for the split infinitive rule to begin with. It's an old wives' tale that goes back to days when grammars were supposed to be based on Latin language, supposedly of precision and perfection.
Well, what is the great lexicographer, oh goodness. Anyway, he wrote in the 1920s under split infinitive, the world is divided between A, those who know, B, those who don't know, those who care, those who don't care, those who know and care. And then he gave instances of the split infinitive which were perfectly okay, instances in which they really should have been avoided. That kind of effort, I think, is justified. Granted, what he wrote then is not always appropriate now, given this evolution. But who was it? The English language is a wonderfully versatile instrument, but there are certain things you can't do with it. And right now, there isn't a word that expresses hopefully in the sense in which you use it, except hopefully.
Someone suggested hopeably.
What's that?
Someone suggested hopeably.
Hopeably.
That's not caught on.
Yeah. Well, how would we say that in your book, with whom is your quarrel?
It's with people who say that speakers of non-standard versions of English are speaking ungrammatically or are ignorant of language. Say people who say that black English is an ignorant form of speech. I'd have a quarrel with them. It's with...
Now, what is your quarrel with them?
Oh, that black English is a dialect. That it's... I don't think we should... I don't think students should hand term papers in black English, but I don't think they should hand term papers in Dutch either. It's not the language of higher education. That is very different from saying that they're ignorant of how language works, which is what people like John Simon have said in print. So I have a quarrel with that. I have a quarrel with...
They're ignorant of how other Americans express their language, right?
Well, in the same sense that I'm ignorant of how
I'd be
Dutch
late
works.
today is to express things differently from how you would express it. And therefore they are either disdainful of your use or ignorant of it.
Well, in the same sense that I'm ignorant of Dutch. I mean, it's a tendentious way of putting it. I would say that I don't speak Dutch, and I would say that students who perhaps use black English don't speak standard English, and it's a good thing if they were to learn standard English as a second language. It's essential that they do. But it's very different from saying that they're ignorant of how language works. So I'd have a quarrel with that.
You mean it's the derogatory character of the word ignorant that offends you?
Yes.
So we need another word for it.
Well, and inaccurate. I mean, it's ignorant generally implies that you've had the opportunity to learn it, but have just not received the news or unaware of what you don't know.
That is a use of ignorant. If you say, I ignore Dutch, it means I don't know Dutch, but it's not used that way anymore. It means I don't know Dutch. And your other quarrel, go ahead.
Oh, that a lot of the traditional guidelines for proper grammar, I think, are old wives' tales, and I think that they should not be treated as the Ten Commandments, as things that come down from some authority, but rather we should dissect language, see what works, see what doesn't, and change the standards as necessary. Just to give you an example, the detested Between You and I, or Give Al Gore and I a Chance. Where does that come from? Presumably, the president wouldn't say something like, give I a chance. So we can't really accuse him of being ignorant of the difference between I and me.
No, you accuse him of having a bad ear, though.
Well, here's what you could accuse him of. You might accuse him of taking the advice of language guardians too seriously, because where that comes from is every teenager has been corrected for saying things like, me and Jennifer are going to the mall. And what parents say is, no, 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 it's Jennifer and I are going to the mall. And people internalize that advice as, when in doubt, say so-and-so and I instead of me and so-and-so. And that leads by a kind of a hyper-correction, correcting yourself even when you weren't incorrect to begin with, to forms like Between You and I or Give Al and Gore and I a Chance. I think that comes from a kind of a ham-fisted rule, avoid I, as opposed to real insight as to how the English language works. And indeed, I think you could even argue, I won't go into this now because it requires some fairly convoluted grammatical analysis, that give Al Gore and I a chance. It's not clear that that's really ungrammatical in English. The tradition says it is. I think that's debatable.
Well, it's interesting because I don't think it's debatable at all, and it's certainly not debatable orally. But I think your argument that because Bill Clinton might have been corrected as a child for that misformulation, he proceeds to misform it in all circumstances, with the equivalent of saying to a child, cross the street when the green light is green, and now every time the light is green, he crosses the street. But that isn't logical, is it?
But you still have to ask, why does a former Rhodes Scholar, a highly verbal man, among our recent presidents, he's certainly one of the most articulate and voluble, why is it that he would misremember such advice? Maybe it's that the advice isn't so good to begin with. And I argue in the language instinct that, in fact, there's nothing ungrammatical about either me and Jennifer going to the store or give Al Gore and I a chance. Because when you stick two pronouns inside a conjunction, X and Y, it's a different grammatical construction than just using the pronoun by itself.
Yeah, but I criticize that, as John Simon did, as being sort of heuristic. You set up a set of rules, and the Menendez brothers go free. But my rule here is not alone grammatical, but a matter of sensibility. You wince and I wince and you wince when somebody says, "I'll give it to Al Gore and I." Why do we wince? Because it doesn't sound natural to us. And your leniency towards abnormality in usage is what sort of distresses me about your thesis.
I wouldn't say that. I'm not lenient across the board. I think it just should be done, if you'll pardon the expression, scientifically as opposed to religiously. I think that good writing is something that you do by practice, by exposure to other writers, by becoming a bit of a grammarian yourself and dissecting your own sentences, not by having a set of laws that you follow and for which you're a sinner if you disobey them. And I think it's that attitude that we need to get better language. After all, a lot of the worst examples of contemporary language, legalese, bureaucraties,
By highly educated people, yeah.
social science, mumbo-jumbo, it's perfectly grammatical. I mean, there are no split infinitives. It just takes a copy editor to turn ungrammatical language to grammatical language. It's awful for many other reasons, and it's really the larger problem of having an aesthetic for language, not following these hoary rules that we have to worry about. Things like simple sentences, fresh metaphors, avoiding cliches, avoiding wordiness, avoiding obfuscation. 99% of what goes into good writing are old-fashioned guidelines like that, not worrying about split infinitives.
Yeah, but I think you're wandering a little bit into the artistic aspect. That is to say, if you submit an essay to the New Yorker, it has to be something other than merely grammatical. There's got to be vivid metaphors and trenchant uses. It's got to be attractive. It draws people in. Now, what are the standards of the people who accept or deny a manuscript in the New Yorker? They are standards which I would hope you would approve of, but manifestly you don't if you think they should regard equally something submitted to them with the kind of licentiousness that you accept and that I don't.
If they were to get upset about, hopefully, about split infinitives,
it would never pop hopefully in the way you use it.
Now, I think there are contexts in which that would make perfect sense. That's not licentiousness. That's just, I think that is part of developing a good ear for the language, is realizing which novel forms actually make the language clearer, make it better, and not simply trying to preserve something that can't and in many cases shouldn't be preserved.
Well, I think it's true that some of the worst English, never mind how grammatically done it is by academics, lawyers especially. I have read stuff by, I read a PhD thesis written for somebody at the University of Mexico, which I couldn't get through 2 or 3 paragraphs. I simply didn't understand what they're talking about. It was just cant. Now, but that kind of stuff doesn't winnow through to those organs that accept responsibilities for usage. I mentioned the New Yorker as an example. Now, people reading your book might think that, among other things, you simply think of them as imposters, i.e. they are exercising authority that they don't have any right to exercise.
It depends on what they do. I think if they get upset about split infinitives, then yes, I think that they're...
No, they wouldn't in the sense that I just quoted. There are people who know, who don't know, who care, who don't care, who know and care. Now, I'm perfectly capable of speaking infinitive, but occasionally you run into a split infinitive, you say, why did they do that? It either does or does not draw you when you read it.
Then we agree. And in fact, a good editor, I think, has a keen ear for innovations and violations of old rules that are worth keeping. And in fact, it's often the pundits, the columnists, the commentators who take a much more rigid attitude than the editors who day to day have to deal with examples of the language, or with enlightened dictionary writers like those of the American Heritage Dictionary, who time and time again puncture all of these myths about what is improper and what is proper.
Well, when you say they puncture it, you mean they submit it to the usage panel and discover that, in fact, that which was thought illicit has become licit?
Well, they don't just take a show of hands. I don't think it's majority rules. I mean, they have linguists on their board.
Yeah, they make their own judgment, but they quote.
Yeah,
but they quote. They give you sort of the vote of the usage panel.
That's right. I think the idea is that since you are going to be writing for other literate people, if you think to use a dictionary to begin with, you want to know what the expectations of your audience are. I mean, English isn't like Esperanto, a language that we rationally design. What is English depends on what is common currency among the potential audience for your writing, and that's why I think it's good to consult a usage panel. Those are the kind of people who are going to be reading your prose. You want to know what they're going to be expecting.
Well, if you're the editor of a publishing house, and somebody comes in using very offbeat English, but it sort of works, I can understand your okaying that book, while at the same time, if you were the editor of a magazine, you would not okay it on the grounds that the magazine might not be a place in which to make a statement about a new use of language, whereas a book would be a logical venue for it.
Yes, a lot of it depends on context. Are you using your own voice?
Yeah.
Are you speaking in someone else's voice? Have you found a slang term that is widely known and more precise than any standard alternative? I use words like to flame and to diss simply because there are no substitutes in standard English. Thank heavens that those forms of slang came about. And in fact, all innovations and all words have to come from somewhere. Someone has to be the first person to use a word. They weren't handed down by a committee. And that means that all words at some point must have been slang, and words like mob, bully, sham, jazz, all were decried as horrible violence against the language when they were introduced. Now they're completely unexceptionable. So I don't think that one should use this week's slang, because chances are it will be embarrassing after a few weeks. But there are some forms of innovation that we should welcome simply because they increase the range of ideas that we can express.
Yeah, my point is that you should resist the neo-tourist passion for long enough to test the question whether the word is needed. I think it was Ronald Knox who said that when the St. James Bible was written, they took 17 ethical distinctions and combined them all into the single word righteous, setting back ethical explorations by 2,000 years. Now that was a capital crime, but at the other end, you want to resist, don't you, words that are used because they're simply useful this afternoon, and make a claim which is not substantiated by their durability.
Sure. If I was to say it's been groovy rapping with you,
Yeah.
then I would be embarrassing myself. And so as in any judged precise use of language, you have to develop an ear for what's likely to be durable and what is likely to be
Rapping
ephemeral.
is durable. But groovy hasn't yet proved out, I think. I think it's been a retreat from groovy.
Well, it's used ironically. It's used as a self-consciously corny way of speaking.
Yeah. But you do agree that there should be that initial resistance. As you say to a new word or an odd usage, you just prove to me that this is useful before I okay you in my next dictionary.
Right. I wouldn't impose some mandatory waiting period, because some words just spread so quickly and are so useful that they can be used right away. To flame is a wonderful example. I mean, there is just no substitute for the word to flame in describing what some people do, and that the word is in common currency is perhaps 10 years old at most.
Yeah. Or surfing through the television channels. That's quite new, isn't it?
Yes, right.
Yeah, but that probably will endure.
It's a fresh enough metaphor that even if someone hasn't heard it, they could very quickly infer what it means.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Pinker. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Next week on Firing Line, host William F. Buckley Jr. talks with New York Governor George Pataki about what's left of the state's authority. This program was a Warren Steibel production, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Annenberg Foundation and the Friends of Firing Line.